Good morning. Thank you, Judy, for those songs of celebration and thanksgiving. I am Chaplain Audrey Carnegie, along with Robert, who is also chaplain here at Landis Homes. And we're going to continue a theme of celebration with the Salt and Light curriculum. Today, we're looking at feasting together as a way of celebration. Family meal times are important, and experts would agree. They cite things like good nutrition, a decrease in risky behavior with children, healthy mental development as just some of the reasons why family meal times are important. There are also social benefits. Ann Brubaker, a senior lecturer at Wellesley College, writes that it can be a space and a time to slow down, listen to one another, to connect, to share about your day or what's going on in your life. It's really like a kind of social glue, she writes, whether it's family, friends, or even people that you know less well, having a meal together is an important way to connect. I was blessed to grow up in a church that had regular fellowship meals. And everyone brought something to the table, and it was usually groaning by the time it was time to eat. And even if you didn't have anything, there was always plenty for everyone, and everyone was welcome. My siblings and I would sometimes reminisce about Verna's homemade yeast rolls or Mabel's vegetable trays with her daisy and carrot turnips and her radish roses. It was the only time that you could get us kids to eat turnips or radishes willingly. They were just too pretty to pass up, and somehow they just tasted better that way. But it wasn't just the food. It was the community all together, adults and children from all generations celebrating the community that God had created as we worship together. In our text for today, God creates a community that connects with each other and celebrates the created world as they engaged in worship and justice through feasting and tithing.
I want to read our scriptures today from Deuteronomy 14, verses 22 to 29, and then Leviticus 19. So Deuteronomy 14, starting at verse 22. Set apart a tithe of all the yield of your seed that is brought in yearly from the field. In the presence of the Lord your God, in the place that will choose as a dwelling for his name, you shall eat the tithe of your grain, your wine, and your oil, as well as the firstlings of your herd and flock, so that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. But if when the Lord your God has blessed you, the distance is so great that you are unable to transport it, because the place where the Lord your God will choose to set his name is too far away from you, then you may turn it into money. With money secure in your hand, go to the place that the Lord your God has chosen. Spend the money for whatever you wish, oxen, sheep, wine, strong drink, or whatever you desire. And you shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and your household, rejoicing together. As for the Levites, the residents living in your towns, do not neglect them, because they have no allotment or inheritance with you. Every third year, you should bring out all the full tithe of your produce for that year and store it within your towns. The Levites, because they have no allotment or inheritance with you, as well as the resident aliens, the orphans, and the widows in your town, may come and eat their fill, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work that you undertake. And then from Leviticus 19, verse 23 to 25. when you come into the land and plant all kinds of trees for food, then you shall regard their fruit as forbidden. 3 years it shall be forbidden to you. It must not be eaten. In the 4th year, all their fruit shall be set apart for rejoicing in the Lord. But in the 5th year, you may eat of their fruit, that their yield may be increased for you. I am the Lord your God.
Sometimes we associate tithing as an obligation rather than a celebration. But think of that fellowship meal or a family dinner where everybody brings something. And even if they can't bring food, they just bring themselves. And it becomes so much more than the sum of its parts. In these texts, we see God establishing a pattern for worship that includes tithing and feasting for the purpose of establishing a pattern that connects God and people, connects people with each other, and with creation in a sustaining and a nurturing way. Tithing kept them connected to God. The tithe was to be brought to a central place of worship in the presence of the Lord, their God, so that they could learn to fear the Lord their God. The feast was to take place in the presence of the Lord your God, you and your household rejoicing together. You see that connectedness. Together they were to acknowledge and celebrate the abundant nature of God by feasting themselves, but also by intentionally sharing that abundance with those who didn't have the means to produce it on themselves. In this way, they were not only connecting in worship with God, but also connecting in generosity with each other. And the gifts they gave to God were for the well-being of the whole community. I also noticed in these verses that God had provided accommodations for those who didn't live close by. It was hard to bring their actual crops and their yearlings and all of that to God. And so to take away the burden of that, God made accommodations. Hey, turn it into money, take the money, go to the place of worship, and then present your offering. It reminded me of Jesus' words, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." In establishing these patterns, it was not intended to be a heavy burden, but a joyful response to God's abundance. Accommodations are also made for those who didn't have land or the resources to produce the tithe being asked. And so the Levites, their main task was occupation in the temple, and they didn't have land. The widows and orphans did not have land or family networks to support them. The resident aliens also. These were all considered vulnerable populations. And so they were provided for with that 3rd year tithe. And in this way, the abundant character of God was in a very tangible way shown in the way that they interacted with each other. It was in a tangible way able to counteract a scarcity mindset that we as human beings so often have. Feasting in God's economy meant that to celebrate God's provision was to celebrate it for all, not just for those who had. After all, the abundance that we celebrated, that they were celebrating, was a gift from God. Yes, it took labor, it took ingenuity of people to grow the crops, but even the strength and the wisdom by which we work is also a gift from God, who intends to provide for all. This care for the well-being of the people also extended to creation in a way. The verses from Leviticus combine the importance of the fruit crop, which was one of the most important or valuable crops in the land, but also looked at the longevity of the trees themselves. So the first 3 years, the trees of the harvest was left alone, allowing time for the trees to mature. The 4th year, the crop was set aside for God, similar to what we see with the feast. It was meant to be in service of the temple and for those protected groups of people. Then on the 5th year, they could harvest the crops for themselves. It was an investment in the community, in the land, which they had to wait 5 years for. I've been watching the Olympics this week, and in each competition, there is a limited amount of medals to be won: gold, silver, and bronze. Some will receive medals and some will not. And it would seem to be a limited economy of have and have-nots, of winners and losers. But I have also watched some of the athletes recognize that there is much more to these games than just winning medals. There are personal achievements. There are stories. There are recoveries. And there is respect for each other. I've seen athletes share the spotlight, lift up and celebrate the achievements of other competitors, express concern for the well-being of the other team. In one clip, I saw an athlete rush over to the medical team who was assisting a competitor, a person from the other team who couldn't walk well, and she just scooped her competitor up and carried her bodily off of the court when they were having trouble. And so when we celebrate and help each other, we all gain something. It's hard not to let a scarcity mindset affect what we do, or even at times the way we worship. Israel itself lost its way at times. The prophet Amos calls out Israel when they lose God's intention in instituting this tithing and this feasting that we see in our text today. And so in Amos 5:21-24, it says, I despise your festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of your well-being, of your fatted animals, I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. Now, why would these things, which God instituted, become repugnant? Something was missing in their actions. They had become self-serving. The haves took advantage of the have-nots. And in verse 24, it shows what God desires in what we do, that these motivations should shape our actions and our worship. Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. So, may our celebration, our feasting, our tithing never be separated from God's intention for the well-being of all people, indeed, all of creation, lest we lose sight of God's heart of justice and righteousness. In response to Robert's challenge of writing a song or a poem last week, Jim Lehman took him up on that and wrote one. He is not able to be here this morning to share it in person, but he gave us permission to share it. And I think it expresses well both this gratitude for God's abundance with a keen awareness that there's still needs in the world that God cares about and that we should care about.
Reflections on a Friday morning. The sunflowers in the garden lift their faces to glorify their Maker creative graces. So too shall all nations and races join in the praises that the flowering garden embraces. But the world marches on with the drumbeats of war. Some captives are released and others' hearts still beat score. Children are hungry, adults grow numb to the gore. Mothers mourn their children who will come home no more. The peaceful lamb appears crushed by the lion. Negotiators are stumped and tired of trying. Hopes fade and dreams of peace are dying. And how can we sing the songs of Zion? How long, we plead and cry. Break through the heavens now, not by and by. They that wait and trust on God, though they sigh, shall yet see new heavens and earth come from on high. As you heard, Jim wrote that after last Friday's devotions. So feasting, and you heard Audrey in that verse in Amos talk about some of the challenges or pitfalls or the ways that we go about feasting. Maybe indulgence is a word. But I want to introduce you to a theologian, L. Shannon Jung. Jung wrote a couple books, Food for Life, The Spirituality of Ethics and Eating, and Sharing Food. He writes about his own struggle with an eating disorder and his consequential battle with obesity. Though he doesn't dwell on the story, his willingness to name it adds immeasurable worth to its writing. And this is from a review of his book. In Food for Life, Part 1, Jung affirms eating as a profoundly joyful act, one through which we delight in God's goodness in the most tangible way. But that joy is diminished, he argues, when the act of eating is disconnected, is a disconnected one, disconnected from its source, the giver of life and sustenance, and disconnected from relationship with our fellow human beings and the earth itself. For Jung, food is a gift. First, it's the gift of delight, a daily and routine reminder of the providence of God. Second, it's the gift of sharing, the commitment to hospitality, mission, and justice that flows naturally from genuine delight. According to Jung, disordered eating is eating disconnected from one or both of these gifts. And if you do have the Salt and Light booklet, this comes from there as well. From Sharing Food, Jung discusses the problem of feasting in the church. He writes, feasting has fallen into disrepute, in a religion suffused or immersed with the reality of the resurrection, liberation, deliverance, and grace and celebration. One might expect feasting to be a central practice, and it used to be. For however, feasting tends to connotate more of what we already have, too much of food piled on top of more food. Our problem is too much rather than too little. I'm persuaded that the origins of this disrepair are profound and potent, he says. Feasting is a communal practice of celebrating in the church and in the culture. He suggests that feasting has become a rare occurrence because we do not know much about celebrating. except over-celebrating or self-indulgence again. Too much alcohol or food or drugs because we are not comfortable in community. We simply do not delight very well. So for John, and maybe some of us, he had an issue in overindulgence, something that has been common at times. And that suggestion about celebrating in the church, that we've lost that part of us. I wonder what you think about that, if you would agree with him or not. And then part of feasting is also the act of communion. Communion as feast. Norman Wurzba, this also comes from the booklet, includes a chapter on the Eucharist table manners, eating towards communion, from his book, Food and Faith. He says, eating food together isn't simply illustrative of ministry, but is instead, it's an enactment. It is important that when Jesus, in Matthew 26:26, took the bread, gave thanks, and then gave it to his disciples to eat, this happened while they were already eating communion. But this happens when they were already eating. Communion happens in the very action of food fellowship. It isn't a spectator sideshow that is otherwise unconnected with daily life. So I want to share some thoughts here as we close from Dr. Norbert Wilson. He is a professor of food economics and community at Duke University School, and also the director of World Food Policy Center. He's also a colleague of Norman Wurzba there at Duke Divinity School. He wrote, I raised the morsel of bread, the host. Looking into the expectant eyes, I state, the body of Christ broken for you. Laying the crummy bread into the bowl-shaped hands, I smile. For a brief moment, our hands touched. Then, almost reflexively, the recipient scoops the morsel into their mouth to receive the bread of life. We share in the charity of Christ. Even before I was ordained, he said, as deacon in the Episcopal Church, I had borne the body of Christ, the sacred bite, to hungry folks many times before. As the paten is an empty vessel to carry the spiritual meal, we who serve God in this meal or any food ministry are here as a vessel for God's abundance. He's done a lot of research and teaching. He said he hopes to engage students, faculty, community members, businesses, policymakers in productive conversations to develop a fuller and better understanding of a just food system. So he moves on from the communion as a feast to food insecurities. Admittedly, some of these ideas of justice are in conflict, he said. In reality, ideas of food and justice highlight political and cultural perceptions of justice and rights on which we have not achieved consensus. He says we must have multiple voices to have meaningful conversations on food in our society. As I said, he works with the World Food Policy Center at Duke University. And he's worked with others as well in food insecurity in children, in a tragic issue around the world and in the U.S. The issue is especially challenging in rural areas, he says. Rural faith communities often play a central role in addressing children's hunger and the support needs and desires of these organizations. And I know he's not alone, and there are many churches and organizations and nonprofits that work at food insecurities. We have several here in Lancaster County. But our home church, our church that we called home in Meridian, Mississippi, over the last several years, instituted some ways of working at feasting and food insecurities in their community. And Audrey was there 5-6 years ago now. She worked there over the summer, filling in for their pastors who were on sabbatical. And this last month, I should have looked up the schedule for this month. They have a church-wide potluck at about the middle of July. And then July 21st, they gather to bag groceries. And then a couple of days later, they distribute these groceries as people come to their church. And then a couple of days later, they open their free store. These are ways of celebrating, feasting, and working at insecurities in their community. So feasting is not primarily about food or drink or an excuse to overindulge. Good food and drink is a means by which we can tangibly celebrate what God has done and look forward in hopeful anticipation of the day Christ returns to make all things new and all believers get to feast with him forever.